The phone rang at 6:23 a.m., and I knew before I picked it up that everything was about to change. Mr. Pearson? This is St. Mary's Hospital. Your father collapsed at home this morning. You need to get here now. My name's Bradley Pearson. I'm 47, and in that moment, sitting on the edge of my bed in the dark, I felt the same gut punch I'd felt 5 years ago when Sarah's doctor called with her test results. Some phone calls you never forget. I threw on yesterday's jeans and drove the 20 minutes to the hospital doing math in my head. Dad was 78, still living alone in the same house where he raised me after Mom died when I was 12. Still fixing neighbors' cars in his garage, still stubborn as hell about accepting help. The doctors said it was a massive stroke. Brain hemorrhage? Maybe 48 hours if we were lucky. Hudson, my 16-year-old son, met me in the ICU waiting room. Kid had driven himself there in the old Honda I'd been teaching him to work on. Same model Dad taught me on 30 years ago. Funny how these things come full circle. Is Grandpa going to be okay? Hudson asked, and I could see Dad's eyes in his face, that same steady look that didn't back down from hard truths. I don't know, son, but he can still hear us. Doctor says we should talk to him. We spent the morning taking turns sitting with Dad, holding his hand, telling him about Hudson's college applications and the transmission I was rebuilding in my garage. Around noon, I realized I had to make the call I'd been dreading. I walked out to the parking lot and dialed Diane Sterling's number. She'd been my boss for about 8 months. Ever since TechFlow Solutions got bought out by some corporate conglomerate back east. Diane came from the finance side, didn't understand the first thing about network infrastructure, but she had an MBA and talked a good game in meetings. Bradley, she answered on the second ring. Aren't you supposed to be monitoring the Apex migration today? Diane, I'm at the hospital. My father had a stroke. I need to take some time off. Silence. Then how much time are we talking about? 4 days, maybe 5. The funeral home needs time to arrange everything, and I have to drive Hudson back to school afterward. That's a problem. We're in the middle of the biggest migration we've ever done. The Apex contract is worth $203 million. Everyone needs to be here. I looked back at the hospital entrance, at my truck with the military decal on the back window, at the place where my father was dying, and felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, exactly. More like a system reaching critical failure threshold. Diane, this is my father. He raised me. He's the only parent I have left. I understand that, but this is business. We all make sacrifices. You can have 2 days, and you'll need to be available by phone for any critical issues. 2 days. For the man who taught me how to troubleshoot a carburetor, how to read wiring diagrams, how to show up every day and do the work right the first time. The man who held me together when Sarah died, who helped me figure out how to raise a teenage son alone. What about the documentation backups, I asked. Not because I was planning to help, but because I wanted to hear her say it. You have everything stored on the shared drives, right? Standard company protocol. I almost laughed. Standard company protocol. In 15 years at TechFlow, I'd written maybe 60% of the automation scripts that kept our client networks running. Custom monitoring tools, disaster recovery procedures, integration protocols for legacy systems that predated half our current staff. Most of it living in my personal folders because the company documentation system was a joke and getting approval to update it took 6 months of committee meetings. Sure, I said. Standard protocol, good. 2 days, Bradley. That's all I can approve. I hung up and stood there for a minute, watching traffic flow past on the interstate. Then I called Roger Walsh, my actual manager, the guy who'd hired me back when TechFlow was still independent. Roger, it's Bradley. Diana just told me I can have 2 days off for my father's funeral. Yeah, she mentioned that. Look, I'm sorry about your dad, but the Apex migration, Roger, you know what I've done for this company. The ransomware attack in 2019. I was here for 72 straight hours rebuilding everything from scratch. The merger integration that nobody else could figure out. I worked weekends for 3 months. No overtime pay, no comp time, just doing what needed to be done. I know, and we appreciate. I've been here 15 years. I've never asked for anything. Not a promotion, not a raise. I didn't earn, not special treatment. I'm asking for 4 days to bury my father. The decision's already been made, Bradley. 2 days is what we can do. That's when I knew, not thought knew. The way you know when a hard drive is about to fail from the sound it makes, or when a network connection is unstable from the packet loss patterns. Some things you just recognize. I went back inside and sat with Dad for another hour. He squeezed my hand once, very faintly, and Hudson swore he saw him smile when we told him about the 1967 Mustang we were planning to restore together next summer. At 3:47 p.m., the monitors went flat, and Edwin Pearson, the best man I ever knew, was gone. Hudson cried then, and so did I, and we held each other in that sterile hospital room while machines beeped and nurses moved quietly in the hallway. After a while, Hudson wiped his eyes and looked at me with that steady expression again. Dad, are you going to go back to work tomorrow? No, son, I'm not. I drove home in silence, Hudson following in his Honda. When we got there, I told him to pack enough clothes for a week, then I went to my study and opened my laptop. 20 years in IT teaches you a few things about leverage. Companies like to think employees are replaceable, right up until they realize how much institutional knowledge walks out the door. I'd been documenting my work in my own repositories for years, partly as insurance, partly because the official documentation system was worthless. Custom automation scripts that saved the company maybe 200 hours a month in manual monitoring. Disaster recovery procedures I'd developed after the last flood that hit our data center in 2020. API integration code for 12 different legacy systems. Network diagrams for infrastructure that predated the current management by a decade. Troubleshooting guides for problems that had cost us weeks of downtime before I figured out the solutions. All of it living in encrypted folders on my personal drives, backed up to my home server. Technically company intellectual property, maybe, but built on my own time when the company wouldn't approve resources for proper documentation. I'd submitted formal requests for documentation budget 3 times over the years. Each time, I got the same response, not a priority this quarter. I started with the shared drives, deleted my backup copies, removed my troubleshooting notes, pulled my automation scripts. Then I cleaned out the monitoring tools, the custom dashboards, the integration protocols, left behind a folder structure full of dead links and a single text file. Documentation removed by original author, no backup available. The funny thing was, they actually thought their system worked. Roger had been promoting this new documentation platform for months, talking about knowledge management and best practices. Problem was, nobody used it because it was slow, buggy, and required 5 levels of approval to make changes. So the real work happened in personal folders, shared drives, and handwritten notes stuck to monitors. By midnight, I'd scrubbed 15 years of accumulated knowledge from their systems. Then I drafted my resignation email. Effective immediately, I'm resigning from TechFlow Solutions. Personal circumstances require my immediate attention. All company property has been returned. All proprietary information has been removed from my personal systems per standard security protocol. Short and professional. No emotion, no explanation beyond what was legally required. Sent it at 12:03 a.m. Closed the laptop, went to bed. Hudson was already asleep, but I could see light under his door. Kid was probably on his phone, texting friends, trying to process what had happened. Losing his grandfather was going to hit him hard. Dad had been more than just a grandfather to Hudson. He'd been a third parent. The guy who taught him how to use tools, how to change oil, how to solve problems instead of complaining about them. My phone started ringing at 7 a.m. Roger first, then Diane, then numbers I didn't recognize. I let them go to voicemail while Hudson and I drove to the funeral home to make arrangements. Dad had been specific about what he wanted. Simple service, military honors, burial next to Mom. Nothing fancy. The funeral director was a soft-spoken man named Pete who'd buried half the veterans in town. He showed us caskets, talked about flowers, handled the paperwork with quiet efficiency. When he asked about Dad's military service, Hudson spoke up. Grandpa was a mechanic in Korea. He had the Bronze Star, but he never talked about it much. Said he just fixed trucks and kept his mouth shut. Sounds like a good soldier, Pete said. We'll make sure he gets the honors he earned. The total came to $8,400, which seemed reasonable for everything Dad wanted. I paid with a check, thinking about how the company had nickel and dimed me on travel expenses for years while sitting on a $2,030 million contract. By Wednesday morning, my voicemail was full. Diane's messages went from confused to angry to panicked. The Apex migration had crashed Tuesday night around 2 a.m. Critical systems down, monitoring tools offline, client threatening to pull the contract. I called back at 10 a.m. right in the middle of their crisis response window. Bradley, thank God, Diane said. We need you here immediately. The network monitoring is completely dead, and nobody can figure out your automation protocols. I'm at my father's funeral, I said, which you told me I could have 2 days for. This is an emergency. We'll pay overtime, double time, whatever it takes. I'm not an employee anymore, but I'm willing to consult. Silence. Then what do you mean? Consult. $400 an hour, 20-hour minimum, paid in advance. I'll work 3 hours per day maximum and not on weekends. My son is with me and family comes first. That's extortion. No, that's supply and demand. You've got a system failure and nobody who understands the infrastructure. I've got the knowledge you need. Business is business, right? I could hear her talking to someone in the background, probably Roger. Then she came back on the line. We need to discuss this internally. Sure. But the clock's ticking. Every hour those systems are down, you're losing credibility with Apex. How much is that worth to you? Can you at least tell us what went wrong, not without a contract? I'll send you my terms. Once I see the payment, we can schedule our first session. Thursday morning, we buried Dad with full military honors. The honor guard was crisp, professional, respectful. They presented Hudson with the flag, folded into that perfect triangle. Kids stood at attention during taps, shoulders straight, jaw set. Same posture Dad had taught me when I was his age. Afterward, people came up to us with stories. The neighbor whose water heater Dad had fixed during a snowstorm. The lady from the diner who remembered Dad bringing her fresh tomatoes from his garden every summer. The mechanic from the shop down the street who said Dad had taught him more about engines than 4 years of trade school. Your dad was old school, the mechanic told Hudson. When he gave you his word, that was it. Didn't matter what it cost him. Hudson nodded, understanding something that most kids his age never learn. That reputation matters. That keeping your word matters. That some things are more important than money or convenience. That afternoon, TechFlow wired $8,000 to my consulting account. I started my first consulting session Friday morning at 9 a.m. sharp. Video call with their entire crisis team. Diane, Roger, 3 junior engineers who looked like they hadn't slept in days, and some guy from corporate I didn't recognize wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people make in a month. Okay, I said, sharing my screen. Let's start with the basics. What exactly failed Tuesday night? Everything, said Jamie, one of the junior engineers. The monitoring dashboard went dark around 2 a.m. We tried to restart the services, but half the scripts are throwing errors we've never seen before. I pulled up my notes, not the ones they used to have access to, those were long gone. These were my personal backup files, the real documentation that had taken me years to build. The monitoring system depends on 17 different integration points. When I built it, I included failsafes for 12 of them. The other 5 were considered low risk by management. I looked directly at Diane. Remember the budget meeting in March where you said redundancy protocols weren't cost-effective? She shifted in her chair but didn't answer. Here's what happened. The primary database connection timed out around 1:47 a.m. Should have triggered the backup connection, but someone, and I'm not naming names, decided to save money by running the backup on the same server cluster. When the primary failed, it took the backup with it. Can you fix it? Asked the corporate guy. I can walk your team through the repair process. But first, let's talk about the scope of the damage. I spent the next hour explaining exactly how broken their system was. The monitoring failure had cascaded into the reporting engine, which fed data to the client dashboards, which were now showing 3-day-old information. Apex had noticed Wednesday morning when their quarterly numbers didn't update. They're threatening to audit our entire infrastructure, Roger said. If they find any other problems, they will, I said. Because this isn't the only single point of failure in your system. I identified 23 critical vulnerabilities over the past 2 years. Submitted reports on all of them. Want to guess how many got fixed? Silence, 4. The ones that affected executive dashboards, the rest were classified as technical debt and pushed to next quarter. The corporate suit was taking notes. How long will it take to stabilize everything? Depends on your team. If they follow my instructions exactly, maybe 3 days. If they freelance and try to improve on my design, could be 3 weeks. What about long-term stability? Diane asked. I smiled, not a friendly smile. That's a separate conversation. Today's session covers emergency repairs only. If you want me to redesign your infrastructure for actual reliability, that's a different contract. We spent the remaining 2 hours walking through the restoration process step by step. I had them document everything, partly to make sure they understood it, partly because I knew they'd mess something up and need to start over. Next session is Monday morning, I said when we hit the 3-hour mark, same time. Wait, said Jamie, we might have questions this weekend. Monday morning, I repeated and ended the call. Hudson and I spent the weekend cleaning out Dad's house. Found his tools neatly organized in the garage, each one clean and in its proper place. Found the watch he'd worn for 40 years, still keeping perfect time. Found a letter addressed to Hudson, written in Dad's careful handwriting. Your grandfather wanted you to have this, I told Hudson, handing him the watch. He believed in doing things right, treating people with respect, and never backing down from what's important. Hudson strapped it on his wrist. Perfect fit. Dad had always been good at planning ahead. Monday's session went smoother. They'd followed my instructions mostly, and the monitoring system was back online. The reporting engine was still throwing errors, but those were fixable. Good progress, I said. You're maybe 60% back to normal functionality. What about the other 40%? Asked Roger. That's where it gets interesting. The remaining repairs require access to the legacy system interfaces, the ones that predate your current staff by about 8 years. I let that sink in for a moment. Then I continued. Here's the problem. When TechFlow was independent, we built custom bridges between the old systems and the new ones. Those bridges are, let's call them undocumented. The people who built them are mostly gone except for me. Surely there are records somewhere, said Diane. There are in my personal archives. Which brings us back to the consulting agreement. Current contract covers emergency repairs. System architecture consulting is a different tier. The corporate guy leaned forward. What exactly are you proposing? Full system documentation and modernization plan. $600 an hour, 40-hour minimum. Timeline depends on how much of the legacy code you want to preserve versus rebuild from scratch. That's $24,000, Diane said, like I couldn't do math correct, which is about what you'll lose in the first month if Apex drops their contract. How much is reliability worth to you? They went into a sidebar discussion, muting their microphones. I could see them arguing, pointing at screens, pulling up spreadsheets, corporate politics in action. Finally, Roger came back on the line. We'll need to run this up the chain. Can you give us until Wednesday? Sure, but the clock's still ticking. Every day, those legacy systems run without proper maintenance increases your risk of cascading failure. Wednesday morning, they authorized the extended contract. By then, word had spread through the industry. I got 3 calls from other companies asking about my availability. Seems TechFlow wasn't the only outfit running on prayer and duct tape. The extended consulting gig lasted 6 weeks. I rewrote their entire monitoring infrastructure, documented every system interface, and trained their team on proper maintenance procedures. Professional work delivered on time with clear documentation they could actually use. During that time, Hudson started helping me with the business side. Kid had inherited Dad's mechanical aptitude and my logical thinking. He set up a simple invoicing system, tracked billable hours, even sat in on a few client calls to take notes. Dad, he said one evening, as we were reviewing the week's work, this is better than your old job, isn't it? Different? I said. Better? We'll see, but it was better. By the end of the TechFlow contract, I'd made more in 6 weeks than I used to make in 6 months. More importantly, I was working on my own terms. No pointless meetings, no corporate politics, no boss telling me my father's funeral wasn't important enough to interrupt a migration project. Hudson was learning things you can't get in school, how to talk to clients professionally, how to estimate project timelines, how to set boundaries and stick to them. Kid was already talking about majoring in computer science, but now he understood the business side too. Dad, he said one evening as we were closing Dad's garage for the night, Grandpa would be proud of what we're doing. He was right. Dad had always believed that good work speaks for itself, but you still have to stand up for yourself when people try to take advantage. He'd taught me that lesson working on cars. Sometimes you have to walk away from a customer who won't pay fair wages, even if you need the money. 3 months after Dad's funeral, TechFlow lost 2 more major clients. Turns out the Apex migration wasn't the only project held together with duct tape and hope. Word got around the industry that their infrastructure was unreliable. In IT, reputation is everything. Diane got transferred back to finance. Roger took early retirement. The corporate guy in the expensive suit brought in a whole new management team and started rebuilding from scratch. They called me twice asking if I'd consider coming back as CTO. I politely declined. Instead, I started Pearson Systems Consulting in Dad's garage. Same workbench where he'd taught me to use tools properly. Same pegboard where he'd hung every wrench in its correct place. Hudson helped me convert half the space into an office, keeping Dad's tool area exactly as he'd left it. Our first client was a small manufacturing company whose network kept crashing every Friday afternoon. Took me 3 hours to figure out their automated backup system was overloading the server during peak usage. Simple fix, but they'd been dealing with it for 8 months because their previous IT contractor kept blaming the hardware. How did you figure that out so fast? Ask the owner. Experience, I said, and proper diagnostic tools. Word spread quickly in our area. Small businesses talked to each other, and they all had the same problem. IT contractors who charged premium rates but didn't actually solve anything. We built our reputation one satisfied client at a time. Hudson turned out to have Dad's gift for explaining complex things simply. He'd sit in on client calls and translate my technical jargon into plain English. What Dad means is your computer network is like the electrical system in your house. If one circuit gets overloaded, it affects everything else. 6 months after starting the business, we had 12 regular clients and a waiting list. I hired 2 junior engineers, both recent graduates who reminded me of myself at that age, eager to learn, willing to work hard, frustrated by corporate bureaucracy. Here's how we do things, I told them on their first day. We document everything. We explain our recommendations clearly. We never promise what we can't deliver. And we remember that behind every network problem is a business owner who's counting on us to keep their company running. 1 year after Dad's death, Hudson and I drove out to the cemetery to visit his grave. The headstone was simple granite, exactly what Dad had wanted. Edwin Pearson, Korea War veteran, devoted father and grandfather, no flowery language, just facts. I got accepted to state, Hudson said, standing next to the headstone. Computer science program. Dad would be proud, I said. I want to keep helping with the business even when I'm in school. Maybe work remotely, handle some of the smaller clients. I nodded. Kid had earned that opportunity. More importantly, he understood that business success means more than just making money. It means building something that lasts, treating people fairly, and keeping your word. The day Hudson left for college, I got a LinkedIn message from Roger. Saw the article about your company in the Business Journal. Congratulations. You were right about everything. Your dad sounded like a remarkable man. I wrote back, he was remarkable. Thanks for recognizing that. That night, I sat in Dad's old chair in the garage, looking at the business plan Hudson and I had drafted for the next 5 years. Steady growth, sustainable practices, focus on long-term client relationships over quick profits. Everything Dad had taught me about running an honest business applied to the digital age. The phone rang around 9 p.m. New client, network emergency. Could I help them right away? I quoted my after-hours rate, explained my response procedures, scheduled a morning appointment. Professional, fair, straightforward. After I hung up, I looked around the garage again. Dad's tools still hung in perfect order. His workbench still smelled like motor oil and determination. Hudson's college textbook sat next to my technical manuals on the shelf we'd built together. 3 generations of Pearson men, each building on what came before, each facing down people who didn't understand the value of honest work and family loyalty. Dad had taught me that respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn. But once you've earned it, you don't let anyone take it away. Sometimes the strongest move isn't fighting the system. It's walking away with everything they didn't realize they needed and building something better on your own terms. Dad taught me that you don't have to accept disrespect, even from people who sign your paychecks, especially from people who sign your paychecks. The business is growing. Hudson's learning skills that will serve him for life, and every morning I wake up knowing that the work I do today honors the man who raised me. That's worth more than any corporate salary or executive title. Listen, if you're dealing with a boss who doesn't respect your family obligations, or if you're watching corporate politics destroy your workplace, remember this: you have more power than you think. Your experience, your knowledge, your professional reputation, those belong to you, not them. Don't be afraid to use that leverage when it matters. Sometimes walking away is the only way to move forward. And sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to accept less than you're worth.